morning to present to you the record of my service as the Honorable Minister of Aviation, and most especially to respond to your request for memorandum on the 19.5 billion naira Aviation Intervention Fund and other related issues. Okay. When faced with the incessant air crashes that bedeviled the aviation sector between 2005 and 2006, President Olusegun Obasanjo redeployed me as the Honorable Minister of Culture and Tourism to the Ministry of Aviation. My redeployment took place in November 2006. Before my appointment as the Minister of Aviation, the country had experienced no less than 5 plane crashes in Nigeria with the attendant loss of approximately 400 lives within a period of 1 year. This was not only unprecedented in peacetime, but it was also a national tragedy and disgrace, and was widely acknowledged as being so. The plane crashes were in no particular order: the Bellevue crash, the Sosoliso crash, the military plane crash, in which some of our brightest and most distinguished generals were killed, the ADC crash, and the crash of a small plane that took place in Kaduna. As if to add a rather sinister twist to the whole saga, virtually all these crashes took place on a weekend. This was a perplexing coincidence and was indeed by a curious and cruel twist of fate. It was clear and obvious to the discerning and spiritually sensitive that the demons of hell had been invoked and loosed into the Nigerian airspace in that 1 year. In all these crashes, distinguished Nigerians from virtually every geopolitical zone, all age groups, and every walk of life lost their lives. Everybody was affected by these air disasters, and that period of utter despondency, sadness, and despair was a defining moment in the history of our country. The whole nation was in a state of shock and fear, and of course the aviation sector itself was in a state of utter trauma. It was in this situation and this volatile atmosphere that I came in. It was indeed our own very annus horribilis, and many homes and families mourned for their beloved yet lost ones. President Olusegun Obasanjo told me to go and do a job, and that job principally and primarily was to ensure that there were no more plane crashes in our airspace. That was the mandate and directive that he gave to me, and I set my mind and heart to ensure that this would be done with military precision and a firm hand. There is no doubt in my mind that what caused this series of crashes was simply the negligence, indiscipline, insensitivity, and impunity of some malignant and malevolent elements and dark forces within and outside the aviation sector. These dark forces simply did not care that the lives of innocent Nigerians were being endangered by their daily ritual of cutting corners in order to make a bit of extra money. They did not care that their habitual breaking of the rules and regulations would inevitably lead to a monumental, horrific cycle of bloodshed. My primary objective as aviation was to take on these dark forces and their agents and to restore discipline, accountability, sensitivity, responsibility, and a full compliance and no-nonsense approach to safety and security issues within the sector. For me, life and the protection of the lives and welfare of the Nigerian flying public was more important than anything else. It was my job to protect these lives for the 7 months that I was at the aviation ministry. We thank God that in that primary assignment, by His grace, we were successful, and the cycle of plane crashes stopped throughout the period that I was Minister of Aviation. For this and so much more, I want to just say, to God be the glory. Now, I'll go straight to the point. Thank you for indulging me, Mr. Chairman. When I assumed duty in the Federal Ministry of Aviation, we discovered the Political Committee report, which was submitted to Mr. President by Air Vice Marshal Paul Dike, had made certain recommendations in order to assist and to ensure the aviation sector, that the aviation sector would improve. One of the recommendations of that report was that 48 billion naira should be released to the aviation sector in order to take care of the infrastructures of the 4 international airports located in Abuja, Lagos, Port Harcourt, and Kano. That was the specific mandate, and that was the recommendation. President Obasanjo and the Federal Executive Council approved 19.5 billion naira out of the 48 billion recommended for application. That was the money that constituted the Aviation Intervention Fund. What must be clearly understood is that not all this money was made available to me when I got there. What happened was that before I got into that office, a substantial part of that money had been sourced and had been spent by my distinguished predecessor in office, Professor Babalola Borishade. Consequently, a sum of 8.5 billion had been sourced, and approximately 8.4 billion of it had been spent from that sum before I came into that office. When I assumed my duties as the minister in November 2006, the sum of 11 billion naira, which was the balance of the intervention fund, was now released to me from the National Resource Development account by President Obasanjo. Apart from that, I should mention here that there was a further 2 billion, which was essentially not part of the intervention fund, but it was also jointly administered by the Federal Ministry of Finance and the Ministry and the Federal Airport Authority of Nigeria. This money was a soft loan from the River State government, and it was given to FAN directly and specifically for the rehabilitation of the runway of Port Harcourt Airport, well before I assumed duties as Minister of Aviation. Out of this 2 billion, approximately 350 million naira had already been spent on other things outside the Port Harcourt runway before I came to the ministry. Therefore, when I got to the ministry, I was given the responsibility of administering 11 billion naira, that is from the intervention fund, plus a further 1,633 million naira. That is a soft loan from River State government for Port Harcourt Airport runway. The records will show, and I have all the records and I will send them as evidence, the records will show that out of the 11 billion naira intervention fund that I was asked to administer, I only released approximately 3.8 billion naira, and out of the 1,633 million naira River State government loan, I only released 1.5 billion naira. The records show that consequently, by the time I left the ministry, approximately 7.2 billion naira was left in the intervention fund account, and a further 133 million naira was left out of the 1,633 million that I was given for the Port Harcourt Airport runway. All the documents are attached, and I'm tendering them, Mr. Chairman. I cannot be held responsible for the 8.4 billion that was spent before I came in, or for what happened to what was spent out of the approximately 7.2 billion that I left behind. I can only be held responsible and accountable for the approximately 3.8 billion naira intervention fund and 1.5 billion naira River State government soft loan that I administered on clearly identifiable projects and items which were highlighted as projects to be funded by the intervention fund well before I got there. I want to reiterate that for every contract that I awarded, the balance of the money was left in the account of the intervention fund for those contracts to be fully paid and upon completion, and that's very important. I also want to repeat that every contract and every penny that we spent went through due process. Mr. Chairman, I just have a chart here with all the expenses, all the expenditures, what I met, what I left, and so on and so forth. I have the chart and I'm tendering it as evidence, plus all the statements, everything. Contracts, projects executed. Before I list my own projects, let me mention what was done with the 8.4 billion of the intervention fund that had been spent before I came in. 6.4 billion was spent on the Safe Tower project, and a further 2 billion was spent on laying off staff at FAN by my predecessor in office. When I got in, I was a little bit concerned because of the huge amount of money that had been spent, particularly on the Safe Tower project. It was clear to me that the contractor did not appear to have delivered the goods considering the amount of money he had already been paid. The whole amount was given to him up front. My first concern was that with all this money that had been spent, we had to ensure that something was done. I immediately directed my staff to scrutinize the execution of the contract and to push the contractor Amsterdam, Vienna and Abuja to do what it had been paid to do. This contract, which had been signed on June 2006, was meant for the refurbishment of 4 airport towers, namely Abuja, Lagos, Port Harcourt and Kano. It is interesting to note that a significant amount of equipment was brought in by the company only after we pushed them to do so. We did this successfully after compelling the contractor to honor his obligations. We did all that we could before we left to pressurize the company to fast-track the importation of the equipment and the completion of the contract. By the time we left, at least 2 of the 4 control towers that had been previously paid for were fully equipped, completed, installed, and commissioned. Whilst fast-tracking the project, I still had some deep concerns about some aspects of the contract and its funding. This informed my setting up a technical committee headed by Captain Shewiyal, as the Senior Special Assistant to Mr. President on Aviation, to look into the details of the contract, its funding, and the execution of the project itself. The committee had very clear terms of reference. A number of controversial issues were raised, and disturbing revelations were made in the final report of that committee. Despite this, the committee, I would have tendered that, but I assume that the committee has that already because I gather that Captain Shewiyal tendered it. But if necessary, I can tender that also. Thank you. Despite this, the committee clearly recommended that the project should be continued because so much money had been spent on it already, 6.4 billion. And this was a vital project for Nigeria's aviation sector. I then forwarded the committee report to President Olusegun Obasanjo, who took further action by directing that it should be sent to the National Security Advisor. When I came in and the 11 billion was released to me, plus the 1,633 million River State government soft loan, the following graphically reflects how I administered and applied the money. Let me emphasize the fact that every contract that was awarded by me was listed as a priority project and costed before I went to the Ministry of Aviation. These are the contracts that I awarded. 1. The asphalt concrete resurfacing of Port Harcourt International Airport runway 0321. This contract was won by Julius Berger. I took the memo to the Federal Executive Council, followed by ratification, and the documents are attached. The contract was awarded at 3 billion. I released 50% of the money. That is 1.5 billion for the contract to Julius Berger. Documents are attached and tendered. That's okay. And the contract, I'm tendering all the documents when I say documents are attached, Mr. Chairman, in law. Okay. And the contract has since been completed.